Welcome to Impact OC, the only program showcasing the people and organizations shaping Orange County. With your host, Don Camber.
Hello, live from the OC Talk Radio studios at UCI's Beal Applied Innovation Center. I'm OC Talk Radio Public Affairs Director Don Camber with another great guest impacting our community in a positive way. Today, I welcome Human Options Chief Executive Officer Maricela Rios-Faust. Thank you, Maricela, for being on Impact OC.
Hi, Don. Thank you for having me.
Maricela, Human Options was founded by 4 women in 1981. Its vision is to have a future in which every person and family in Orange County experiences safe, healthy relationship and lives free of fear. Please explain how Human Options lives up to that vision.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In the last 40 years, we've really done a lot to learn from the people that we're serving. And so what we do is really listen to the survivor or the victim that's experiencing relationship violence and determine what it is that they need. Us living into that mission is really understanding what is it that is causing the abuse? Why are you in this relationship? How can we help you safely get out of the relationship? What are the different things that we can approach? When we started 40 years ago, we started as an emergency shelter. It was actually founded by, as you said, 4 women. They started doing a survey, and then that survey, they were trying to get a sense of why was there so much depression and anxiety in women. And what they found was many women were living afraid in their own home. And so they began to unpack this issue of domestic violence in Orange County. As they listened more and more, they also determined, people need somewhere to go. And so they developed an emergency shelter. And again, Human Options began to grow simply by listening to those that we were in service of. What we've found over the course of 40 years is we can intervene when someone's fleeing an abusive relationship. And we also want to provide the tools for someone to recognize when you're in an abusive relationship, where you can go to help. We want to help first responders be able to say, I know how to respond. So if someone comes to me and says, I'm in an abusive relationship, or is describing things that are scary and abusive, that we know how to intervene and support that person. And then more recently, we want to be in communities and we want to change the way that everybody works with survivors, because we know when they try and access help, it's oftentimes the way that they're received that stops them from going back to ask for help. There's a statistic, it takes 7 times for somebody to leave an abusive relationship. What we find is oftentimes those 7 different times, it's because when they reached out, someone wasn't able to listen to them. They asked questions around, why do you stay? They weren't able to really provide this space where the victim felt heard and cared for. And what we find is that is reinforcing the same narrative that abusers often say, which is no one will ever care about you, no one will love you the way I do, and no one will believe you. And so how we listen when someone shares their story becomes critically important. And as an organization, that's something that's important to us. And that's how we continue to live into the mission and the vision from 40 years ago.
Describe abusive relationships.
Sure. So abusive relationship, we recently, actually over the last 5 years, we've begun to really evolve our language away from domestic violence to relationship violence. One of the reasons we've done that is because oftentimes when you hear domestic violence, there's a connotation around that. It's physical abuse, it's the yelling, it's the screaming. And what it really is it's actually much more nuanced than that. Oftentimes it could be something where it's an undercutting comment. It's controlling who you can see. It is really being watchful, monitoring every single behavior you have. Maybe it's withholding money. Maybe it's threatening to hurt someone you love, or share a story or share a picture if you do something. Those are all different signs that the relationship is unhealthy. It can go from something that's verbal, something that's emotional, psychological, physical, financial. Those are all ranges of relationship abuse.
Is it always men providing the abuse to the woman?
It is not. That's so they say 1 in 4 women have experienced some form of relationship violence, and 1 in 7 men. So the numbers are, they're predominantly it's women. Predominantly women suffer more physical abuse and more different types of abuse, but men also have been abused and can be abused.
Now, is there violence?
Yes.
In the form of?
So if we're talking about both, right, there's physical violence in terms of actually physically hitting and assaulting. It can be used, strangulation is a common form, or attempts at strangulation. Those could be something where sometimes the victim will minimize, or not minimize in terms of like it didn't happen, but when they describe it, they'll describe, I was grabbed by the throat and shoved against the wall, or they put pressure on my throat, right? So there's these variations of strangulation. It could be weapons that are used, so household weapons and items that are used to abuse or scare. Those are different forms of violence.
And then there's the verbal.
There absolutely is a verbal. So the verbal is actually, I would say, more nuanced. It's more undercutting. It's like, wow, why are you wearing that? That looks awful. Who are you trying to date? Like, whose attention are you trying to get? Cursing, right? Calling somebody a bitch. I'm sorry, I don't know if I can say that, but just
you could say that. You could say that. It's okay.
Just different. So it's different ways where it's really much more aimed at demeaning. And stripping somebody away, stripping the dignity that somebody has away, right? Really little by little, chipping away at all the self-confidence, all these words where it's like, well, every time you go to your mom's house, like you're not taking care of the kids, or something that really begins to erode someone's confidence. And those are all of the verbal tactics that somebody uses to maintain control or gain control over the survivor.
So who are you helping?
We here in Orange County are helping individuals and families across the spectrum. So we help from anywhere from somebody who is trying to flee an abusive relationship and needs shelter because it's really a life-threatening situation. They need to get into a place where they can stay safely. We are also helping young teens who are early in the relationships, starting to learn how to navigate healthy relationships or unhealthy relationships, helping them identify signs within their own relationships and or their peers' relationships, really creating them, giving them the opportunity to be ambassadors. And then also in communities, it's sometimes what we find is there is, I'm going to use a man in this case who identifies. This is, may say, gosh, when I grew up in an abusive home, I watched my dad abuse my mom. And I swore that was never something I was going to do. I swore that I would be a different type of person. I've been married for 6 months. I'm starting to notice that I'm getting tense. I'm using words with my wife that I never thought I'd use with my wife. I really need some help and support. And so those are that's the spectrum of individuals that we seek to help and really provide some support. That's sort of the most immediate people that we serve. The others are really those who are in professions where we want to make sure that they're equipped and feel like they can effectively respond to somebody when they're in abusive relationships.
So what are the demographics of the people you serve?
There isn't any single demographic. Our demographic is really all socioeconomic, all racial profiles. Where we do have a more intensive, I would say, visibility and or concentrated approach is we are the cities of Santa Ana and Costa Mesa, and the reason for that is to increase accessibility. Right? We want to make sure that anybody who needs access can gain access to our services, and so in those communities we have walk-in centers. We have 9 walk-in centers throughout Orange County, and they are all intended to be locations where we want to make sure that the barrier is not access. Right? A barrier. There's so many different barriers to being in a healthy relationship. We don't want access to be one of those.
But teens can get help.
Absolutely. So teens also, we go into high schools. Right now we're actually doing a lot virtually. We do different service groups. We run an ambassador program where teens are able to come in and learn how to be leaders within this field, learn about the dynamics of relationship violence, go out and train and or identify types of abuse in their friends. We've actually had young teens who have been in the program, learned about the dynamics, and then all of a sudden realize, oh my gosh, my best friend is in this relationship, and so they intervene in that way. And or we have had young individuals who have said, I know my friend's in an abusive relationship. She's depressed. She won't come out of her room. He's using social media to control her, and really trying to navigate how they get help for that individual.
And how do you help the individual?
Really, if the individual is working with this, we're working with them on trying to build self-esteem, trying to gain showing awareness that it's not you, right? This is not something that you're doing. You're not causing this. If we're working through someone else, so if we're with an ambassador or with a first responder, it's helping them provide an environment in which this individual could tell their story and be heard and supported, and that the message that they're giving is you're cared about. this is not you. It is not okay to be abused. It is not okay to be, physically assaulted, and you are not causing this, right? Because that's the number one thing that they're being told is they are the reason that they are being abused, and that's a message we want to change.
And of course, you're dealing with people who know that they're in an abusive relationship and they need to get out, so that you help them like now.
Right. So that's in our, we actually have a 24-hour emergency hotline, and that operates, and that will gain them access into our emergency shelter. So through that hotline, we will screen them and determine, what's the situation? Can they safely get out that evening? Is there the opportunity for us to assist them? We also have a partnership with the Santa Ana Police Department where we have an advocate that does ride-alongs on weekends. So Fridays and Saturdays, they go out with the officers and they will respond to domestic violence calls. What we find that creates is it creates an opportunity for survivors to have a supportive person on scene, so the officer can do the investigation and the advocate is really providing resources. During that first instance, you may be so overwhelmed that you can't hear all of the different things that are available to you, but you will remember that somebody was there. And so when that person follows up and says, like, what can we do for you? How are you doing? You already have built that sort of connection. And so for us, again, we're trying to make sure that we have the 24-hour hotline so somebody could call.
And give us that number.
Sure. It's 877-854-3594.
And give us that number again and how they can find that number.
Sure. 877-854-3594. And you can go to www.humanoptions.org as well in order to get that number.
And who operates the hotline?
We have hotline advocates, so they're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They come in, they actually support our clients throughout and victims and survivors throughout the process. They can either get them connected to emergency shelter if that's the need, or they can get them connected to another service, whether it's legal advocacy or a service nearby.
And you also help families.
Correct. So in the, I'll sort of throughout the continuum of our services, we offer support to families. So what we find sometimes is maybe it's the child that is the first person who got identified or identified that there's a need to bring in mom. And we have had cases where there's a teenager or a young child who just watch our community educators come into the classroom and listen to a presentation. And what they'll say is, oh my gosh, this is my mom. And so they'll either get the mom to call our hotline, or they'll take them to one of the walk-in centers. And that's the very first person that we see that's interacting. Then we provide services for both the parent and the children. So providing social-emotional services for the kids, trying to get them to express their feelings in a way that they feel, when they feel safe. So it's anywhere from anger, depression, sadness. Oftentimes what we find is kids bottle that up, or they're so angry that they can't really interact in a normal manner. So we're trying to get them to identify, like, I'm really mad right now. This is what's upsetting me, and then giving them the space to talk about it, so that those emotions, they don't go away, but you're able to process why you're so angry, and you're able to process why you're so sad, and you're able to feel things that you typically can't feel when you're walking on eggshells.
So what are you hearing from teens about this whole arena of relationship violence?
Yeah, so from teens, I think it's difficult, right? Their whole relationships are played out through social media, and you're catching a lot of things where there's an unrealistic expectation. There's this, image is important. Everybody knows what's happening. Like, it's the idea that everything has to be perfect. I think there's some acknowledgement and recognition of what a healthy relationship is and what it isn't. The other, though, is that sometimes it's really hard to reach out for help. So when there's so much invested in, like, oh my gosh, I have to be perfect, or I have to do all of these different things, it's easy if somebody slides right in there and starts to, again, pick at those little things, like, oh, you're always with your friends, you're never paying attention to me. And some things are done under this guise of, it's because I love you, I'm trying to call you all the time. It's because I just want to make sure you're not with anybody else. And so helping kids identify, this is something that is a red flag, talking to your parents. I think at some point between adolescents and teens, it's harder and harder to talk to parents. Everybody's so busy. But for parents, it's really understanding, like, how do you make space to talk about relationships with your kids? How do you create this opportunity where it's just a casual conversation, so that when and if, and hopefully it doesn't happen, but if it did happen, where they were talked to in a manner that was not respectful, how would they come to you and share that? If they had a boyfriend that was being abusive, or a girlfriend that was being abusive, what's the type of conversation that you would have and want to have with with your teen?
How are you able to help the teens? And you have to talk to the parent because the parent is the the one in charge of the teen.
Yeah, so a couple of different things. So with the teens, it's really giving them resources, trying to find, again, ways to kind of talk about what a healthy relationship is, boundaries, how you might interact in that conversation. I think if a teen is in counseling, that's a different relationship. That process would work a little bit differently. Most often we're in situations where we're in group settings and doing more educational opportunities. And again, it's really around the warning signs. It's really around who you could reach out to for help, what you might want to say. If somebody feels like they're in much more danger, than getting them connected to another service, whether it's if there's a restraining order that needs to be filed, they can get connected to legal advocacy. Most of what we're doing with the teens, though, is really the early warning signs. Here's how you know. So if a relationship is on a spectrum, and here are the things that you begin to notice first. And if you're noticing those things, that's when you get out of the relationship. And so hopefully really trying to prevent an instance of physical violence in that case.
Is it worse now than it was in the past?
I don't know that I would say it's worse now than it is in the past. What I would say is I think we still have a issue here, specifically in Orange County and throughout the U.S. The other part is I think that things have intensified more. So people are much quicker to act violently. The words that we use with one another are much more volatile. Tensions are really definitely at a level that they haven't been. And so I think we maybe see it more often, and or somebody's trying to hide it more actively. So over the course of the last 2 years, particularly with the pandemic, what we have seen is, I talked about strangulation, is that that has increased in the cases we see. And what that to us indicates is that in the home, it's the pressure that's occurring in the home is much greater, and so physical violence is on the rise. What we see is, that there's a cycle of power and control, and so most often in these cases, an individual, a particular abuser, will begin, it's first everything's fine, then there's a tension building time where things are starting to pick at things, they're starting to get more volatile. Then the big argument, the big fight, the big explosive episode happens. And then it comes back to like, oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I was under all this pressure. I'm so sad. I love you. There's all these things. And so what we call sort of that honeymoon phase. And they start to go back into, I really need you to be with me. I'll never do it again. During times like the last couple of years, is that reprieve that occurs during that honeymoon phase, it's shorter and shorter because there's no space, there's no one there, everybody's together all the time. And so again, that creates a higher risk of just sort of explosive episodes because there isn't that opportunity to take some time.
Now, getting help, is it usually the person that needs the help calling, or is it someone calling on behalf of another individual?
Yeah, it's both. We have different circumstances, as I mentioned. Sometimes we've had the youth or a teenager who's bringing their parent in and saying, this is somebody I think you need to talk to, and oftentimes it's them taking the first step. Sometimes it's the person themselves who's being abused and hoping, right, and they're sharing their story and not quite sure what they need. Sometimes it's a friend. We've had employers who have recognized or identified signs within their employees, and they say, this person was a vibrant person. All of a sudden they're quiet, or they're withdrawn, or they're late all the time. They've reached out and trying to figure out, what can I do as an employer to help them get the support that they need? We work with first responders, healthcare practitioners, law enforcement. So it could be really anyone in our community has the opportunity to affect change for a survivor.
So ultimately, when a person gets help, what happens?
So when a person gets help, what they ultimately do is, first, if they are fleeing and they need a safe place to go, they have that safe place to begin to heal and to begin to develop a plan on what are their next steps, whether it's safe housing. So do they need their own apartment? Are they able to go back to their home? What is the healing process that occurs? For others, maybe it's when they get help, it's more of a deeper understanding of what is the dynamic that's happening. And sometimes, quite honestly, is this an abusive relationship? Because sometimes it's so subtle that it's hard to pinpoint for people, and it's hard to go, this is abusive. And so really giving them that base where they can learn more is something else that happens.
So what can you tell people if they need help, they should feel comfortable reaching out to get it?
Yeah. What I would say is if you are somebody who is being abused or you know someone that's being abused, please reach out to the hotline. You can also look on our website at www.humanoptions.org. Talk to a healthcare provider, talk to someone, and know you are not alone. And there are plenty of individuals who are out there willing to help and support you. Abuse is not okay. You do not deserve to be abused, and there are people that can support you.
And we're also dealing with seniors. They can experience this.
Yes, with seniors, what we find is sometimes they, I guess, maybe I could share a story that I think kind of illustrates what happens with seniors. Is we've had senior women who have been married, and maybe they were married for 45 years, and that 45-year marriage was an abusive marriage from the day. We had a senior who on her wedding night, she experienced physical abuse by her husband. Could not find the way to leave. They had children. Every time she attempted to leave, he would control her with the kids, threatened to keep them, threatened to take them away. So really manipulated that. Eventually, about 40 years in, she got the strength and the courage to get him out of the home and leave him. And then her adult son began abusing her. And I remember when we were talking, and I know it's just the look of shock that you had, right? Is I had the same reaction, like, oh my gosh, like this woman has raised this young man, and it's taken all this time to be able to get herself out of this abusive relationship. And I'm talking to her, and she said, it took me 40 years to get the courage to call the police on my husband. She said, I just as a mother cannot call the police on my son. I'm supposed to be here to protect him. How would I ever call the police? And it absolutely broke my heart, because it's definitely one of those things where it's like I understand the sentiment and understand the feeling, and also know that there's no reason she should be abused. And so really trying to help support senior through that process, because what they really want is that connection and engagement with family members. And so what we're trying to do is find the family member who can take care of her, right? So she doesn't lose connection with someone, while also recognizing that the adult son, it's not a healthy relationship. It's not healthy for them to have them, and trying to create some intervention for the adult son and her.
How can people help your organization?
They can get involved in a variety of different ways. We definitely, if you go to the website, there's ways to get involved either through our wish list and getting things for both the emergency shelter or different residential programs. There's also ways to get involved in some of our service groups, and we have an upcoming gala, which is called Serious Fun. That's in May 21st. We invite you to join us and learn more about the organization.
Thank you, Human Options Chief Executive Officer Maricela Rios-Faust, for being on Impact OC. And I thank everyone for tuning in. I'm OC Talk Radio Public Affairs Director Dawn Camber. Have an impactful day.
You've been listening to Impact OC, the only program showcasing the people and organizations shaping our community. Right here on Orange County's only community radio station, OC Talk Radio.